think we can get started. Aloha mai ka ko, e nā hoaloha, e nā haumana, a me nā kumu, a me nā mea helu helu, aloha ia. Aloha, welcome to everybody, to students, professors, teachers, friends, and beloved readers of our American Indian Culture and Research Journal. My name is Randy Aki. I am the editor-in-chief of the American Indian Culture and Research Journal. I'm a professor here at UCLA, both in American Indian Studies and the Department of Public Policy. I'm Native Hawaiian, born and raised in Waipahu, Hawaii, and happy to be here. I'm currently talking to you from the ancestral homelands of the Gabrielino Tongva people in what is known as the Los Angeles Basin, or Tovangar. And I'm really excited to welcome you all to this really exciting event, which is a presentation and discussion on a special issue of the American Indian Culture Research Journal that was co-edited by two fantastic co-editors, Dr. David Shorter and Dr. Kim TallBear. And we will have a mix of recorded interviews as well as live readings. And then there will be a significant portion at the end of this event for question and answers and just discussion amongst all of you. For those of you who aren't familiar with the American Indian Culture and Research Journal, it's a journal that has been in place for almost 50 years that we have published here at UCLA. It focuses on American Indian topics and studies, as well as indigenous peoples from the continental United States, as well as other parts of our world. And we see our mission to bring more research and make it publicly available to our broader networks and communities. And one of the ways we're doing this is striving to make our journal open access in the future, which means that it will not be behind subscription or paywalls. And so this event here is one of our ways of bringing research out into the community and making people aware of the work that's going on, and making it on with, by, and for, and in Indigenous communities, and making some of this more accessible. So with that, I welcome all of you and look forward to this really exciting event. And with that, I'll introduce Dr. David Shorter, whose first book, We Will Dance Our Truth, evolves from decades of learning about Indigenous lifeways, primarily among the Yomi communities in Northwest Mexico. And Dr. David Shorter is a full professor at UCLA in World Arts and Cultures. David.
Thank you so much, Randy. Mahalo. Thank you so much for everyone who's here today. I'm sitting on Tongva land right now, and I'm very much appreciative of the support that the American Indian Culture and Research Journal gave us over the last few years. I came to this project, as you might read inside the actual journal, from a kid living very much close to the Mescalero Apache Reservation and having family on and off Indian lands there, while also having a father who worked top secret for the government doing reverse engineering on UFO crash site material. So I was, as a child, somewhat coming to terms with what it means to be an American in the US Southwest near the Mexican borderlands, but also very much an Indian country. And so when it came to proposing a panel for NISA, Native American Indigenous Studies Association, in 2018, it dawned on me that these issues were going to be really fertile to talk about a range of issues. And I reached out to Kim TallBear and said, hey, do you want to take this working group project and take it into a conference panel presentation? And luckily we had all the makings right there. Sonia Atley, Kim TallBear, Willie Lampert. We had already done the working group statement for this Breakthrough Listen group, which is an offshoot of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. It's actually the most well-funded outfit for the exploration of whether there's technosignatures or signs of intelligent life, of advanced civilizations, all of which are terms we take apart inside this special issue. Now, let me just jump to the ending there. What are the terms that we sort of were struggling with? It was quite amazing. Between 2018 and the actual publication of this, we realized that the contact zone, extraterrestrial topic, the search for intelligent life, it became a focal point to really understand settler science, more broadly. And that's how the title came into being for our special issue. Joanne Barker did the cover for us, and the images that we've been posting on Twitter for the last 6 weeks are so incredible. Thanks to Joanne Barker, a Lenape scholar and artist whose last book, Red Scare, just came out 3 weeks ago. So thanks to Joanne. I want to save time here by giving just a shout out to the words that Kim TallBear and I wrote in the intro, where we say, listening, watching, surveying, penetrating, extracting, studying, owning. These are a series of triggering actions that have been continuous throughout Indigenous histories with others, specifically with colonizers. And these issues came up for us, and we began to think together about how to collect these perspectives, theories, and feelings into a single volume. So while we don't criticize SETI or Breakthrough Listen specifically, we are using this opportunity to bring together working papers, websites, and voices that we then call the search for extraterrestrial intelligence to tell us something about settler science more broadly. And to do that, we had some of the best authors. Willie Lempert does this fantastic thing in his piece where he really takes seriously Star Trek's Prime Directive. So some of this is going to speak to some of those sci-fi people in the audience. And then he really looks at Captain Cook through the notion of Star Trek's Prime Directive, and then connects it to Dipesh Chakrabarty's notions of time knots. So it's kind of actually brilliant. And then using also this notion of time is David Oahekea Maile's cruising, his notion of working on different time frames, and then applies that to his first person activist voice of protesting Mauna Kea. And so then we have a connection to the land back movements through his piece. Rebecca Charbonneau does this, then layering on the notion of observatories and telescopes and asking, why are the telescopes where they are at in the world? Why do they offer us a point to examine how native land has been taken? And why do we need to unsettle those histories, particularly the histories of discovery? And then we have Suzanne Kite, who then says, and one of those histories is manifest destiny, which, by the way, was always going to lead to the apocalypse. So what other options do we have besides an apocalyptic ending to manifest destiny? In order to get there, we have to reorientate ourselves to the relations that we have with both humans and other than human persons. And she really draws upon Lakota ontology to get to these arguments that she makes. Fantasia Painter has this amazing piece which asks if close encounters have been taking place of either the first, second, third, or fourth kind, on whose land have they been taking place? Isn't it all Indigenous land? And so therefore, do ETs offer us the possibility of breaking through some different binary besides just Indigenous and settler? And where do settlers fit then inside the context of a third non-settler, non-colonizer view? It's a really brilliant piece, which is, you're going to hear a little bit more about her in a bit. And then lastly, it was such a treat to break outside of the scholarly voice that we often think of when we think of academic journals alone. And we have Kim TallBear's embodiment of a persona that she created years ago and has spoken through in some of her, I think, TP confessions, but without a doubt, you want to stay for this next half hour because she's going to read directly from her piece for us in the embodiment of is, which is an Indigenous person who is in a polyamorous, or you might want to say non-monogamous relationship with a Western scientist. And she then has to find herself asking, how do we relate and what kind of boundaries do we draw among ourselves for our own protection? So I went over slightly 5 minutes, but I really felt it was important for those of you who have not read the journal yet to get a sense of all that it contains. It also has great book reviews in there as well. Thank you so much to Randy and the American Indian Culture and Research Journal, particularly the staff who worked so hard to get this publication to light, as well as to make this event possible. Gracias muchos. I'm going to now actually go to the video that we recorded previous. For those of you who did not know what you were joining us for today, We have actually pre-recorded videos with a couple of the authors, and then we're going to have an open forum at the end after those. The first one is with the special issue author Fantasia Painter on her article G-Men, Green Men, and Red Land, Extraterrestrial Miscreants, Federal Jurisdiction, and Exceptional Space. And this interview was something that I took with Fantasia several weeks ago.
David, just to clarify, can you see the video right now?
I can you?
Okay, great. I'm going to play it.
Great.
Hi, Fantasia.
Hi, David.
So glad that you can make this time with me. For those of you who are watching us in this interview, I am speaking with Fantasia Painter. She's the author of G-Men, Green Men, and Red Land, Extraterrestrial Miscreants, Federal Jurisdiction, and Exceptional Space, which is in the special issue that I co-edited with Dr. Kim TallBear. It is one of the most amazing pieces in the journal, at least for me, because I come from the Southwest, and you take up the issue of cow mutilations, which was something that was actually happening. Kind of a great thing to get your proposal, but anyway, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, David. I'm honored to be a part of this special issue, and I'm really excited to be here with you today.
So where are you at now? Like what position are you in, and what's going on in terms of are you working remotely, or where are you?
So I am technically in Davis. I'm currently a UC President's postdoctoral fellow in history at UC Davis, go Ags, and where I'm calling from and where I'll be starting in July of 2022 is UC Irvine, where I will be starting as an assistant professor in the Department of Global and International Studies.
Perfect. I love it. And where is your research in general? Because I'm assuming a lot of people who are doing pieces on UFOs and aliens, that isn't their main gig. What is the bigger project?
So my research broadly sits at the intersection of Native American and Indigenous studies and the study of borders and boundaries. So my current book project titled Bordering the Nation, Land, Life, and Law at the US-Mexico Border and on Indigenous Land, a mouthful, investigates the construction of intra and international borders on Indigenous land in what is today known as Southern Arizona, starting in the 19th century to today.
Wow, that's going to be incredible. I just love it. I love the confluence of topics that you're working on, something very close to my heart, working with a border community like myself. I have to ask though, like, since you weren't part of the original working group, which was Sonia Atley and Willie Lemper and Kim TallBear, and we went and did this sort of advisorial role to Breakthrough Listen, which was a SETI affiliate. After we put a call for papers, that's when you got involved. So what was the relationship between this larger project and something as weird as UFOs and settler science?
Okay, I love this question. I'm so glad you asked it. So I came to this essay and the research it's built upon in a roundabout way. And it all began, as many good things do, with beloved 1997 film Men in Black, starring Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. Stay with me, stay with me. So the opening scene, it takes place on a fictional 2-lane highway in Southern Arizona called State Route 375. It's nighttime in the desert. See my background. It looks a lot like the indigenous lands and landscapes I write about in my book. So in the scene, there is this windowless red van that drives up to and pulls over at a group of Border Patrol cars that are obstructing the road. And after recognizing and briefly speaking with the driver, Border Patrol discovers a group of 10 or 12 people in the back who have presumably just been smuggled across the US-Mexico border. So as the undocumented border crossers file out of the van, this black car pulls up and the men in black step out. Agent K, played by Tommy Lee Jones, tells Border Patrol, "We'll take it from here." He then, I know this is a long way to go for a short drink of water, but stay with me. He then speaks to each of the border crossers who are at this point standing in a line on the side of the highway and he discovers that one of them doesn't speak Spanish. So he dismisses everybody else and tells the Border Patrol agents kind of in this famous line, "You fellas can hit the road, keep protecting us from the dangerous aliens." And later in the scene, we find out that what we thought was an undocumented border crosser is actually a fugitive extraterrestrial named Mikey.
Right.
And so you've seen the film.
I just remembered that part right now.
So Mikey is this criminal from another planet. He has flippers and fins, and he was only posing as an undocumented border crosser. An alien to Earth posing as an alien to the United States. So this scene, right, that takes place at my current that doesn't take place at my current research site, led me down this massive academic rabbit hole to try to understand the doubling that's going on here. And I was interested in two things. At a basic level, I was interested in the relationships and resonances in the cultural or national imaginary between the alien, as in the extraterrestrial, Mikey, and various cultural figures. So in this film, in Men in Black, it's the immigrant. In others, it's the colonizer, the invader, the missionary, even the native. And I'm talking about Avatar. And it turns out there's like a lot of really smart people thinking through and publishing on these same questions. I love reading. I love my job. On a deeper level, and one closer to my work and to the essay I offer in the issue, what struck me about this scene is not only how aliens are imagined in terms of the law, in this case through the terms of international turned interplanetary immigration law, but also how the jurisdiction of the alien is imagined to play out. So the Men in Black represent the secret organization that's both inside and outside of the government with unlimited jurisdictional power. And I was really interested in, or I wondered how these spaces of sovereignty, right, are incorporated or incorporative. And so incorporation, or the delineation of land and authority in the US-Mexico border lands, it's something that I'm theorizing in my current book. So, and I think a lot of people will recognize it as a very Native American studies line of inquiry. But to fast forward a little bit and to get to the primary material of the essay, while researching the topic, I encountered what I call in the piece, the Cattle Mutilation Archive, a collection of FBI files released under the Freedom of Information Act and available online through the FBI Vault, which is like so wild, look it up when you have a chance. And the files concern a national string of cattle mutilations in the 70s, which you were just talking about, and you grew up around.
Yeah.
And we're talking about like thousands of cows in 21 states dead under, to use a technical term, hella suspicious circumstances.
Yeah.
And many people believed and still believe that aliens were to blame. And the best part about the Cattle Mutilation Archive, okay, no, that sounds bad because I'm talking about dead cows.
Right.
What I mean to say is I knew I had to write about it because I found that initially FBI officials didn't have the authority to investigate at all. Much of the archive concerned negotiations over FBI jurisdiction, but ultimately it was decided that the FBI could investigate mutilations if and only if they occurred on Indian reservations on recognized Indian land.
Wow.
So like Indian land in this archive emerges as the condition of possibility for like the official federal search for the alien.
Yeah.
So in the archive, I had federal jurisdiction, Indian land as an exceptional space, and the construction of borders and boundaries. That's my bread and butter. Plus aliens, which
Right.
I mean, as fictional interventionist characters, like from these other worlds, they lend such clear insights into the anxieties and hopes of the national imaginary.
Yeah.
And I'm usually getting at that in terms of imagined and racialized subjects and subjectivities. But this was even better. Like, how cool is that?
Right. And that's one of my actually favorite parts of your piece is that I think it's about 75% of the way through this essay. You have this line where you say it's interesting to imagine that if aliens from another planet do land on Earth, there's a probability they're landing on a reservation or Indian land. And then it's like a semicolon or something. And then you're like, but even if they're not on a reservation, they're still landing on Indian land that's occupied. And I was like, wow, that's such a great double reading of who is the alien at all. And I just think your piece plays with that wonderfully. I have to ask you, because I wrote a piece for the journal as well, and I had aha moments where I was like, well, I did not think I'd actually be talking about this. And this happens a lot with writing, where you're like, okay, I'm gonna write these like 3 points. And then at some point you're up at night and you're writing, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm actually writing about that. Did you have any of these? Were there any like aha moments or surprises that you were writing about something you did not think you'd be writing about this year?
That's such a good question. Yes. First of all, I talked about it constantly with my family. My family knows so much about aliens now. But okay, without too many spoilers, I do have some really big feelings about this research. I will say that because federal agents were limited by their jurisdiction and the actual investigation files in the archive are authored by local police, those folks saw some gnarly stuff. That was like my biggest aha moment. So beyond like the typical dead cow, you've got like strange markings, what the officers call precise incisions, tripod tracks, like fluorescent markings. And in one report, the officer wrote that the cow must have been airlifted, mutilated elsewhere, and then like dropped back down from the air. And like the files are just wild. And what never gets answered is who or why or how.
Right. So this is crazy. I love it. I also love how like all of us, because of some of Joanne Barker's artwork, because some of the pieces are more about aliens, and some are more about, you might want to say, the borderline of paranormal. I kind of bring that up. I gotta end with this question. Do people now ask you questions about what you believe?
You know, no one has asked me that yet, but
so here we go.
No. But I will tell you that I, as research, watched X-Files as research. And I'll tell you what I don't believe, which is,
I like that.
I for sure do not believe that Scully and Mulder as FBI agents would be out there running around investigating all these crimes and phenomena that are clearly under state jurisdiction. No flipping way. Like the truth may be out there, but if it is, it will be a jurisdictional nightmare to find.
I love that angle on it. I love it. Joanne Barker, who I used to watch X-Files with her in her apartment in graduate school in Santa Cruz, she's going to get a kick out of that. I love the jurisdictional angle on the truth is out there. And I also love some of the wording in your essay, particularly about the truth being on the res. And I guess as a final, I just want to say, you're a really great writer. Thank you so much for contributing to the special issue.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you saying that. And it has been such a pleasure to be in community with all you folks.
Thank you so much. UC Irvine's very lucky to have you. Have a great night.
You too.
All right, take care.
I wanted to just thank Fantasia again for being part of that interview. For those of you who are with us today, just know Fantasia has just joined us, which means she'll be available later for any of the Q&A. I knew that there was an introduction inside that video, so I didn't introduce her personally, but the one thing I realized in hindsight that I did not say, or that she did not say, is that she's also an enrolled member and citizen of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. So thank you so much, Fantasia, for being available for that interview. And now we have a real treat today. For those of you who know, Dr. Kim TallBear is quite well recognized for her, not only her scholarship, which is amazing and invigorating, but also her performances. She did a very, you might want to say, embodied piece that she's going to read from today. If you don't know, Kim TallBear is professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Society, a Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. She has podcast that she does. I think Media Indigena might be one of the best ones that you can find her at. She's a citizen of the Sisseton Wapata Ayote, and she's the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promise of Genetic Science. And she studies colonial disruptions to Indigenous sexual relations as well. It's such a treat to have her with us today. Kim TallBear.
Thanks, David. I thought I was going later, but that's all right. And there's a hand up too. I guess people should know, I think we're saving questions for the Q&A later. Is that right?
Yes, and we're also going to have some people able to answer the chat questions as they come in, particularly if it has anything to do with the journal or getting access to the articles.
Okay, cool. Okay. All right. So thanks for everybody for joining us. I see there's quite a few people in here. I'm coming to you from Edmonton, Treaty 6 territory in the province of Alberta in Canada, where a lot of the convoy people originate from, if you were following what was going on in Ottawa. So the essay, I think this closes our section of the issue, our part of it, and it's that I'm going to read an excerpt from this. It's probably going to end up being about 8 minutes. And the final essay is called Close Encounters of the Colonial Kind. And I have to say, I didn't follow a lot of the conversation among the other authors. I don't watch Star Trek. I don't watch much of that stuff. I do not know what they're talking about. So I have to go all the way back to the 1970s for my sort of sci-fi references when I was like 10 when Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out. So I'll give you an introductory note, firstly, to kind of orient you in this essay. Much of this essay is written in the voice of Is, capital I, capital Z, which is a character that I introduced in the book chapter, Dear Indigenous Studies, It's Not Me, It's You, Why I Left and What Needs to Change. And that is in Aileen Morton Robinson's edited 2016 collection, Critical Indigenous Studies. And Is, this character that I'm speaking from, or out of the mouth of, represents the evolving field of that began as American Indian or Native American studies in the US in the second half of the late 20th century. Today, a later disciplinary iteration, Critical Indigenous Studies, is representing a coming together not only of US-based, but multiple Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty political movements around the world, wherein Indigenous scholars began to define the terms of their intellectual engagement with universities. And that was a quote from Aileen Morton Robinson's intro to that 2016 collection. So this is a much longer essay, and I'm really looking forward to being able to do it somewhere. I haven't done it yet. But I'm going to skip ahead to the kind of final ethnographic vignette that pieces of that I have in this essay. And that final piece, it's an ethnography of a conference, which is something science studies scholars, I didn't know, started doing maybe 15 years ago. And it's entitled Is SIP's Big Science Nectar? San Jose and Berkeley, October 2011. So this is not about the Breakthrough Listen initiative, and there's is speaking to that experience of putting that working statement together earlier on. But I'm going to skip ahead and back in time to something that I think kind of helps ground these types of engagements. I am not only a lover and a storyteller, I am also an anthropologist, chiefly of the colonizer. But sometimes I bring my anthropological eyes to observe and glean insights from other Indigenous people as I seek to understand how we are making our way on this planet, and perhaps in relation to worlds beyond this one. Rewind the years to the autumn of 2011. Join me in the cavernous, marble-floored San Jose, California Convention Center for a few days when it was abuzz with 4,000 Chicano, Native American, and other POC scientists. In that warm October week, I attended one of the largest meetings dedicated to promoting racial diversity in science. On the final night of the conference, I put my arrows away and sashayed on heels into the San Jose Convention Center for the closing night's banquet. I was high on new relationship energy, NRE. A romantic night awaited me. Waiters in black tie were gliding, bending, and twirling efficiently among the rainbow of several thousand laughing, glitzy dressed scientists. We were about to sit down to a several course meal paid for by sponsors, including major scientific research agencies and foundations, donations in the tens of thousands of dollars, up to $100,000 donations by several prestigious universities. This was not a cash bar reception with a few fruit, meat, and cheese plates, like at social science and humanities meetings. I sat down at a banquet table with 7 other scholars, all young Indigenous scientists, still in graduate school or in postdocs. I was the lone is at the table. We were all laughing and buzzed on the energy in the room, the sound of clinking glasses, and with huge expectations for the dinner talks and the show ahead. After several days of being impressed over and over again with Indigenous and POC science, the dinner plates were cleared at the final banquet. What happened next still makes my heart palpitate and sends shivers up my back. The lights in the cavernous banquet hall were turned completely down, and the Star Wars theme began playing. 2 astronauts hovering midair in the International Space Station appeared on screen, so much larger than life. They had recorded a personalized welcome for all of the scientists. The room swelled with a towering wave of laughter and applause, mine included. I caught my breath and I caught myself. I understood like never before how intoxicating can be the nectar of big science and technology. I was certainly not the only person at my banquet table to feel like I'd traveled a long journey from that reservation border town where I grew up. Sharing the moment with a promising and gregarious young Diné scientist sitting next to me, my emerging shock and growing awareness of the colonial pain it took to produce every aspect of that moment in history was mixed also with pleasure, pleasure and pain, pain and pleasure over and over in waves. My pleasure dissipated completely when the astronauts in the space station signed off the video feed and we all came back down to Earth, to San Jose. The big name speakers took the stage. 2 middle-aged white men from my own highly ranked West Coast university, both in positions of power and with esteemed scientific careers. They gave talks meant to inspire. Perhaps many of the young scientists in the banquet hall were moved. A bit older and schooled in anthropology and histories of science, I recognized the same regretful gospel I had heard from the mouths of past scientific lovers. From those white ministers of science on stage, I heard the driest King James-like version of universal knowledge, unencumbered by any reflection on research institutions, centuries of violent explorations and discoveries. There was certainly no recognition of the genocidal covering over of knowledges of ancestors of the very peoples filling the banquet hall. Holy, I came down hard from my NRE during that oration. Having sobered up from a peak buzz of big science nectar, I was profoundly weary as I drove the 47 miles to where I lived in the city in the hills by the bay. I drove that night to where the phallic University Tower rises amidst tree-covered swells, where the big men of science perch also in their labs and houses in the hills, many with wives and ever so successful offspring. The gospel of inclusive excellence rings regularly throughout the city, just like it did in the San Jose Convention Center that night. Meanwhile, the houseless camps continued to grow around the lush university grounds and in those glittering streets that sparkle less if you bother to look down into the doorways, parks, and sides of the highways where the tents, sleeping bags, and shopping carts proliferate. More than a few of the rough sleepers have returned wounded from the empire's wars that both seed and manifest technological fantasies of exploration, discovery, and relentless attempts at covering over the realities of peoples and nations the world over. And I'm going to close with 100. It's a 100-word poetic vignette. These are peppered throughout the essay, and I also publish them on my Critical Polyamorist blog. This one's called Indian Sci-Fi. 21st century noble savage. I escape in a pod to the sky. Launch beyond planetary myths that we are mastodons, bones lodged in earth and museums, relics to adorn the living. Settlers war for inheritance. Glued to the video feed, I peer across centuries and a field of orbiting debris. Their projects continue in labs, courts, bloody streets. The probes, imprisonments, eliminations do not abate. Techniques shift form. Humans versus animals parsed by priests, scientists, CIA. I tried to be their citizen, but the dead cannot inherit. The dead are inherited. I hope relatives among the stars will take me in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim, for making time for today and for all your work as a co-editor of this special issue. One of the reasons I really feel like Kim should go before we get to David's piece is because Kim's story is so personal that it accentuates in some ways the stakes. And due to the recent publication of this special issue, I was invited to work on some curations with some, you might want to say, very, 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 very STEM orientated people so they could bring us to the same conversation table. And I said to the organizers, these are not always nice conversations. We actually disagree very seriously about what's being talked about when we talk about discoveries or exploration. And one of the STEM scientists in the room said, well, for example, what is it, would you say is the bottom line of what you're calling settler science? And I said, well, we say it pretty quickly in the introduction to the journal, which is things aren't things sometimes. What you see as non-life is not necessarily what indigenous people see as life. And his response was, well, then you're wrong. And we got to say wrong when we see wrong. And that's the way those conversations are taking place. I wanted to lead that as a means to say what serious issues there are, and these are hit right on the head with Oahekea Maile's piece on being late, cruising Mauna Kea, an unsettling techno-scientific conquest in Hawaii. And if we could please play that video.
So I am here with, and I'm going to attempt to pronounce your name correctly because I know I've practiced in the past, and then you correct me if I'm wrong. I'm here with Oahekea Maile, assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And how did I do on the pronunciation?
Did great.
Okay, good. We are here to talk about, your pronouns are?
He, they.
Okay, he, they, and I'm she, her. So about his article in our special issue of the American Indian Culture and Research Journal that David Shorter and I co-edited, and the title of that special issue is Settler Science, Alien Contact and Searches for Intelligence. And Dr. Maile's article in that special issue is called On Being Late, Cruising Mauna Kea and Unsettling Techno-Scientific Conquest in Hawaii. And it is a complicated but fascinating article. Well, I don't know, I thought it was kind of complicated, but maybe others who are more internal to the conversation won't. And the article is theorizing in some interesting ways, and Dr. Maile will talk about that, the actions at Mauna Kea to protect the mountain, the work of settler astronomers in attempting to build telescopes and do work there that is in conflict with Indigenous caretaking of that land. And so I've got a couple of particular questions, and it's been a few months since I read the whole article, but I went back and looked at it today. So I'm going to start with the first question about this article. What does it attempt to do? Why is this work important to you? And then why is it important for Indigenous studies as a field?
These are great questions, and mahalo for asking these questions to me, Kim, Dr. TallBear, and for inviting me to participate and working with me along with David, Dr. Shorter on this. This has been truly fun and hard at the same time, but really rich. So the article centrally is a critique of what I call in term haole technoscientific conquest, while simultaneously analyzing the movement, the Kanaka Maoli-led movement, the Native Hawaiian-led movement to protect our sacred mountain Mauna Kea from the development of the 30-meter telescope at the northern plateau of Mauna Kea. And so what I mean by haole technoscientific conquest and my critique of it, first of all, I think necessitates what I mean by haole technoscientific conquest. And so how I understand conquest and technoscientific conquest is regarding the telescope observatories, particularly extremely large telescopes, as their scientific term is. It's such an innovative term, extremely large telescopes, and their functionality and science case for exoplanet research. Exoplanet research is a twofold study in astronomy that centers on the search for planets outside of our solar system, hence exoplanet or extrasolar planet, as well as the attempt to discover and classify forms of life, extraterrestrial life, alien life on these planets outside of our solar system. So on one hand, this form of conquest is about making contact with non-human forms of life, but also about finding an Earth analog planet that humans can inhabit for settlement and colonization. And so that's what I mean by technoscientific conquest. And I specifically qualified as haole technoscientific conquest because of the unique formation and assemblage of technoscientific conquest in Hawaii. We have two mountains, two different islands, Hawaii Island and Maui Island, sacred mountains, Mauna Kea and Haleakala, that both have massive amounts of infrastructure for telescope instrumentation and observatories. Actually, across the way on Hawaii Island from Mauna Kea is the Mauna Loa mountain, which has a telescope instrumentation as well on that mountain. So it's a very unique assemblage of haole technoscientific conquest, which is specifically run primarily by white settler men. So the article is a critique of haole technoscientific conquest, but it's also a focus of the critique from the movement itself. And so I've been organizing and coordinating in the movement as a Kanaka Maile community member, as someone who has relations to Mauna Kea and Hawaii and my Lahui Hawaii. And so I've also been interested in the ways that Hawaiians have unsettled haole technoscientific conquest. And at the same time, like you mentioned, taking care of our relationships with Mauna Kea as an animate, existent, and relative. Mm-hmm. So that's what the article does. It's important to me because Mauna Kea is, as I just mentioned, a animate, vital, existent to our people, and we are related to it as it is related to us. It's known as Kapiko Kaulana o Ka'aina, the piko of the Aina, the famous piko, and piko is our word for umbilical cord, but it's also a word that describes a kind of center genealogical origin. And so it's an origin for Kanaka Maoli, and it's also a place of gathering. And so it was no coincidence then that in 2019, at a recent iteration of our blockade, thousands of people, Kanaka Maoli, gathered to protect Mauna Kea. So it's an important site and relative to us. And so the article, to answer your last question, I think has a really important novel methodology and method, and that is writing the land back. So it's a method for Indigenous scholars working in Indigenous studies in our own movements to protect our lives, our lands, our sacred sites, and our sovereignty. And so writing the land back is important in the article because fighting for land back also requires the documenting and the writing of the movement itself from folks within it, not from folks that are armchair experts.
Right. So that was a question I had. And if I remember from reading the article, I mean, it totally makes sense the way you're saying it. And I probably should have gotten it, but I wasn't exactly clear what writing the land back meant. But it means writing about this resistance and the place of these mountains as relations within your worldview and your set of world practices. And so writing it back is a way to land back in a sense, or to support that project.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
And in no ways am I saying that writing about territorial decolonization is more important or more valuable than actual reoccupation or territorial decolonization. But this is why I think it's a novel method as well as a kind of framework, because it's a way to pursue research from within land back movements for decolonization that are fighting against projects that are particularly oriented around technoscientific conquest and ideas of objectivity. And so the methodology as a subjective one that is sort of autoethnographic and talking about my own experiences working at the blockade, but also in an international divestment movement to call Canada to divest from the 30-meter telescope. It's near $300 million investment. You know, there are front lines everywhere, and there are so many of us in Indigenous studies that are working on multiple front lines. And I think it's important for those to narrate our experience at the same time as landing really important critiques, especially of projects that purport to be searching for absolute scientific truth, when in fact it's really hiding the ways that which there are subjective ideas about whose truth matters more.
Right. And I'm thinking too about, I just thought this was really methodologically interesting, which is why I'm glad you addressed what writing the land back means, right? I think it also does something where it's collapsing that divide between, but in a way where you can still make a case that this is rigorous peer-reviewed research, right? Which is, we know that's what that's the language that we in a sense have to appeal to, right, in the academy. But there's a way in which you're collapsing that divide between, you're not using Indigenous people in your community as informants at all. You're there among them doing this work. And in a sense, when you're writing the land back, they're also the theorists that are informing this work. They're not informants as much as they're theorists and thinkers.
Absolutely.
And so for Indigenous studies, then, why is this important for our field? Did you see? I'm thinking about what is Indigenous studies usually at. I mean, just to, disclose my agenda, which I don't think there's enough grappling with the role of science and technology and governance is central to Indigenous studies. Well, do you want to say more about that or something beyond that?
Yeah, so beyond just thinking about this as a kind of novel method and methodology, which I think is important for the field of Indigenous studies, and I mark it out in my article specifically as important for critical Indigenous studies, and I think that that's a valuable distinction that I make and, probably talk a lot about in this short time that we have, but I will not go there completely. I think it's important in the sense that as a Indigenous political theorist myself, someone who works within Kanaka Maile movements for decolonization, deoccupation, demilitarization, that is tethered to these other fields in interesting ways. I believe strongly in advancing movements in my research and in thinking, like you just mentioned, about how movement builders and movements themselves are theorizing. And so that's how I'm coming to this idea about haole technoscientific conquest. And so in the work itself, I try rigorously to demonstrate through the movement and through an analysis of the movement what that is and what it looks like. But also at the same time, certainly this is a essay that is important for Indigenous studies to think about how science is a discipline, especially in its Enlightenment sciences and natural sciences like astronomy, that is not neutral, that is not just seeking objective truth, but in fact is weaponizing our ways of being, our ways of knowing, valuing and valorizing places like Mauna Kea in ways that are appropriating Indigenous Hawaiian worldviews for ends that are actually quite nefarious, like colonization in space, or the way that alien life is valued over Kanaka Maoli life. And that this form of natural science, which is mapping itself in a kind of settler scientific way through Haole technoscientific conquest in Hawaii, is particularly objectionable because it's an attempt to turn away from our relations on Earth by valuing possible relations in territories or planets away from our solar system and non-human life away from our solar system. And so it's an old trope of attempting to scientifically find the next frontier and settle it that depends upon the colonization on Earth of Indigenous peoples, our territories, and our lands. And so that form of natural science, astronomy, astrophysics, and cosmology is manifesting in a particular settler colonial and capitalist way on Earth. And it's important, in my view, for Indigenous studies to think about how science, settler science, is nefarious in these sorts of ways, not just discursively, but materially. And we also, as Kanaka Maoli, have our own kinds of technology and science related to Mauna Kea that doesn't require the conquest of other forms of life or other planets in order for our planet to thrive.
So yeah, it's not only pushing back on settler science or colonial science, but it's also foregrounding and centering Indigenous ways of doing science that have more relational frameworks. So we've used up almost all of our time because this is so fascinating. So in 1 minute, can you talk about what's next for you, both in your scholarship and activism? How's that for a challenge?
What's next is I'm working on a book, and one chapter of the book is dedicated to my research on the 30-meter telescope in Mauna Kea and the movement against the 30-meter telescope being built at Mauna Kea, in a larger criticism of what I term settler colonial capitalism and trace throughout the book. So it's a book that's doing historical research to think about the ways that capital has greased the wheels of colonialism in Hawaii, and specifically in the late 1830s and early 1840s through money, monetary taxes, and exchange value. And the latter half of the book looks at two contemporary sites for thinking about manifestations of settler colonial capitalism, and TMT and Mauna Kea is one of them. For organizing, there's so much going on. The pandemic has, in many ways, exacerbated the bureaucratic nightmare that is the 30-meter telescope and our organization against it. However, we have also finally trained ourselves during this time to be better prepared for the next round, if you will, of this fight. And so right now, the Canadian astronomical community and the US astronomical communities have both agreed that TMT is a #1 priority. And there is a process with the National Science Foundation now to evaluate a near $1 billion grant that would really inject more capital into TMT. That process will take a few years. And so we'll be at each step of the way along that process, calling on NSF in the United States to not build this 30-meter telescope, or to not fund it, and to ensure that our consent, or our lack of consent, I should say, is heard.
Thank you. I want to do an extended panel on this now so we can have an even longer conversation. Thank you,
That'd be lovely.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been great to work with you.
You as well.
Mahalo, Kim. Mahalo, Oahekea, for that interview that you made possible for us. I want to just simply say, in conclusion to our presentation, before we go to the open conversation today, which we should still have a healthy 30 minutes for, that the journal as a whole in some ways stands like a book. It's almost a holistic collection in which you can start putting the pieces together. A lot of what Oahekea was expressing was inside the second chapter, the one that I wrote, which looks at settler science as an object-orientated and progressivist science, which is why there is no such thing as a neutral object-oriented science. And that we really have to ask ourselves what are settler methods and methodologies and what are indigenous methods and methodologies, so that we can get around to something beyond logocentrism to better understand how indigenous people are not just resisting something called science, they actually have their own science, in the same way that like braiding sweetgrass has actually proposed that as a text as well. Again, I want to thank the editor-in-chief, Randy Aki. Thank you so much for making this event possible, for suggesting it, for working with the staff. Thank you so much, Pamela Peters, Pamela Greenman. Thank you for all the authors. I'm not going to get a chance to say this to you directly until I say it right now. So thank you so much for contributing to this important journal that Kim and I have been working on for years. Thank you to Sonia Atley, who couldn't be here today and who was a member of our original working group, and to Joanne Barker for her original artwork. Many of the authors are here. I don't think Suzanne Kite is, but I think the rest are as members of this panel. So please feel free to, if you want, look at the table of contents that Randall Aki had posted inside the chat. See if there's anything inside those texts you'd like them to extrapolate on. And then I'm going to hit both the question that was posed with the hand up by Lilium first, and then go to the question that Roger has posted in the chat. But anyone else, feel free to use your raise the hand function to get in order. Okay, Lilium just lowered her, so that's fine. Okay, I think this first one is for you. It's Roger. Roger, did you want to propose it yourself, or?
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, so I am an instructional designer in Long Beach, and my clarifying question was about writing the land back. And it just starts with just trying to understand for myself what that involves. So does it mean being with activists in land back movements? I don't have any experience there myself. And leveraging interviews and observations from their movements in research?
Hi, Roger. Thanks for this question.
Mm-hmm.
The methodology and method that I write about in this article, in the special issue, which again, mahalo to David, to Kim, to everyone with the editorial team, to Randall. It's great to be in a place, a electronic virtual place all together to say that, and to say mahalo nui loa ya'oko. And to get back to my answer to the question, as both a methodology and a method, it does a few things, which I already discussed with Kim, but I'll just re-clarify, I suppose. As a methodological approach, it frames research by scholar organizers and activists. And in that, I reference other folks that are quite busy writing the land back, even though they perhaps are not referring to it in that sense. But by naming it and labeling it a methodological approach, my hope is to name and label a orientation for future generations of land defenders, of mountain protectors, of water protectors, who are also engaged in scholarly research and academia as part of these movements for decolonization, as a part of the communities that are articulating the terms, the self-determining sovereign terms of territorial decolonization. So it's a novel methodology in that way. I believe for folks like myself and others, I'm thinking about Tlingit scholar activist Ann Spice, Lakota historian Nick Estes. I'm thinking about my colleagues, Kanaka Maile scholar Iokepa Kasumbo Salazar. These are all folks that have already been doing this hard work, and it is hard work because it is not exactly as the question asks, Roger, that writing the land back is in terms of method, right? In terms of method of analysis, of data collection and actual analysis and interpretation. It isn't about being with activists in land back movements and leveraging interviews and observations. I didn't do a single interview with any activist in the land back movement at Mauna Kea. And I think if you read the article, you get a sense of what I mean by that. And in many ways, as Kim was asking in the interview and what I'm doing in the article, is actually the opposite. I am the native in some ways studying the colonizer as a part of this methodological orientation, which is I'm also writing about my experience in an international divestment campaign. I'm here in Takaranto and Dish with One Spoon Treaty Territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, the Huron-Wendat. And at the University of Toronto in Takaranto are some of the most influential Canadian astronomers on the 30-meter telescope project and who have been influential for decades. And so when I left Mauna Kea, when I left the blockade, I moved and relocated to Toronto. And I started to stare down St. George Street towards the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics and asked myself, should I go talk to these faculty? And I did. And so a lot of my observations there enter into the analysis and are reiterated in the analysis of the article. And so even in that sense, I'm not doing like formal interviews, but these are embodied experiences of working on unsettling haole technoscience in some sense globally and transnationally. And so writing the land back is a methodology, it's a method. It's about identifying the constant struggle for territorial decolonization by and for Indigenous peoples, as well as working on writing through that struggle by and for Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be using your piece in my research methodologies class in the spring as I teach research methods to graduate students, because you are adding something new to the table. It's not just using other methods. It's actually assuming that there's an intersubjective relations between the land and the movements that we're in and the work that we're supposed to be doing. It's making the neutrality kind of disappear as a fake myth of science. And I love your piece for that. I also, just because you didn't say it, want to say to everyone who's in this room, there is a postdoc available to work on the development of Indigenous political science methods and research projects at University of Toronto with Maile, right?
That's right. Come work with me at the University of Toronto in political science.
Awesome, thanks. All right, so the name on this next question is Luke's.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Sorry, Luke.
That's okay. Luke, go for it.
Yeah, I don't know if I put Luke. Sorry, that's my. Yeah, man. So, I come from Wyoming. I personally have seen UFOs in the sky. I first, came from a very settler background, colonial background, education-wise. I started a journey all alone in Montana State University while studying cinema there, and started diving into Native American cinema as a study, and made a lot of interesting friends there, and started this long journey of a love affair, I guess, with Native peoples from all types of tribes. And there's so many origin stories, and even all these origin stories seem to tie back to coming from clay or being molded by gods and becoming man. And in the scientific community, when you bring up God or things like that, it's always kind of a messy subject for some to grapple with. But this is the kind of questions I really love. So do you have any thoughts on alien, influence on the creation of man, but from a scientific point of view?
From a scientific point of view, I don't, but I know that there's 4 people in this room who are really aware of their Indigenous stories of, you might want to say, proto-humans or other than humans. In the tribe that I worked with for 27 years, they had a sense that their ancestors went underground and some of them went up into the sky, and that relationship is still pending. They're going to come back together. So that's from the Yoame people of Northwest Mexico that I work with. And I know that there's similar across the Southwest. Does any of the panelists want to talk about from their own tribal stories or Indigenous stories about that? Original or originary myths? I know Rebecca looked at it a bit. Suzanne's not here, but she would have had some, I bet.
I can put a link. I don't talk about that specifically, but I can put a link to an essay I wrote in Gene Watch in 2013, where I talk about the ways to think about indigenous quote unquote origin stories alongside scientific origin stories, and to focus on the materiality or the relationality of different beings across time and place. And it helps us think about why we don't necessarily have to reconcile those things. And I mostly wrote it for scientists who are so literal and mutually exclusive in their truths. Anyway, I'll put that link in the, it's a partial answer to your question, not the most sexy or fun answer, but it's kind of an answer.
No, but that's exactly what I'm looking for. I think it's an interesting question, at least to postulate in a discussion like this, which is, you know, I remember in my biology class, it was like, well, all humans, something happened right here at 10,000 years ago. But then it's like, okay, well, we have stories of indigenous people from saying, hey, we're hundreds of thousands of years old. So there's all these timelines, and you're right. I think like landing on a specific answer is not really, it's like kind of just like opening up the scientific mind to say, hey, there's possibilities that we're not even aware of. Like even like to me, like an alien thing that you know, you get put as like a conspiracy weirdo, but like I think that amongst my own people there's aliens, and I've seen them, you know. And so it's like, and what I mean by my own people is white people. I think there's alien white people out there, and they're the ones that love to divide and conquer. You know what I mean? So it's interesting. Anyways, thanks for your answer.
Yeah, thanks for offering the question, Luke. There's something that we talk about inside my Alien Psychics Ghost class, that one of the things that the sort of lens of alien and alien contact brings to the forefront is this ability to see that Native people have been telling stories that go so far back that in some ways it's almost humorous when science has some sort of theory. It's almost as if, we've been saying this for generations and generations and generations. So that's a key component that's come up too, which is what counts as contact. We're talking about people who have stories from the land that are about contact that predate even what we might want to say is, you know, scientific stories of contact. Mo Quirk.
Hi, yep, that's me. Hi, I'm calling in from Wangle Land in so-called Sydney, so it's very early here, so sorry if I'm not completely coherent. I was really interested in what Dr. Maile,
Yes?
sorry, I missed the pronunciation of your, oh, sorry.
I'll go with what?
Somebody's unmuted, I think.
Yeah, we're going to mute everyone, and then you go ahead and unmute Mo Quirk.
Great.
Go for it.
There we go. So I was really interested in what Dr. Maile, sorry, I missed the pronunciation of your last name, what you said about appropriating Indigenous knowledge and colonization for the colonization of space, and valuing alien life and alien knowledge over Indigenous life and Indigenous knowledge. A little bit of background, I'm a PhD student and I'm writing about cryptids in North America and how they stem from European misinterpretations of regional Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous concepts. And I just wanted to ask if you had any like kind of related reflections on what you talked about regarding, I guess, kind of quote unquote terrestrial supernatural stuff like unknown animals and cryptids and that sort of thing, and also kind of the more broader terrestrial supernatural stuff, because I really am interested in that, in the idea of like Indigenous knowledge versus, I guess, Western European like STEM knowledge.
Yeah, this is a good question. I don't actually have a great answer for you in this particular question that you're asking. In terms of translation, I can say one thing, and then in terms of a different kind of translation, I can say another thing. On one hand, what I was referring to in the interview is the appropriation of Hawaiian language in particular, and Hawaiian language meanings and understandings and ways of knowing that then get mapped onto the naming of celestial phenomena, right? Like dark holes and other kinds of things and stars, as a way to buffer the colonialism that is taking place in terms of scientific conquest in Hawaii on indigenous lands, right? So it's a kind of classic case of, cultural recognition and multicultural sort of liberal reappropriation of indigeneity as a way to funnel and marshal forms of violence that get hidden in the names of these different things like po'ovehi and whatnot in the Hawaiian language. So that's kind of a classic case that other Kanaka Maoli scholars, like I mentioned, Iokepa Kasumbu Salazar writes about, and he writes about how that affords settler scientists and astronomers an ability to also claim a fictive kinship, as he writes, to ancient Kanaka Maoli that were seafaring and scientific sort of early age astronomers. And now modern astronomers at Mauna Kea are refining what they did. And it's also a way to stake a claim in this like racialized idea of indigeneity that sees Hawaiians in the past and modern astronomers in the present for the future. So that's one thing. The other thing is, most specifically the kind of translations of bodies. And this is kind of what I was getting at with that second example. When European explorers were traveling to Hawaii to measure the transit of Venus, our people, and in particular at the time, David Kalakaua, who was mo'i and ruler of the Hawaiian Kingdom's constitutional monarchy and government in the 19th century, set up a small land-based telescope. And that image was actually used in different official documents that were being brought together by the state of Hawaii and different stakeholders for telescope and observatory development projects as a way to rationalize that our king, our mo'i, our esteemed ruler, who was very open to Western forms of science, would somehow approve and justify the building of a telescope project like the 30-meter telescope project in the here and now. And it was a very nefarious example, I believe, of the kind of translation of Kanaka Maoli bodies for this type of technoscientific conquest. And so again, this doesn't really answer your question, and I apologize for that, but it's not a part of the research that I'm doing. But it's a good question to ask and interrogate. I'd love to know the answer.
Yeah, my undergrad thesis was kind of on a similar concept in Australian Indigenous appropriation of terms and stuff. And I'd love to email you, chat with you about this kind of topic and kind of get some more sources, because obviously I'm always looking for more Indigenous sources on this sort of thing. So thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting answer to hear.
Thank you so much. Alexandra Karapetrova.
Yeah, thank you for the talks. I am a PhD student at UC Riverside, which is on Kauai, Tongva, Serrano, and Licino tribal lands. And I study microplastics in the environment, and one of the questions I had, and I think this ties in with the discussion on Mauna Kea too, and the 30-meter telescope, is science tends to reward this ambitions that are tied with novelty, new, big, and these things are very extractive. I think it's pretty obvious, but one thing that I'm trying to seek and learn is how, and anyone can comment, how do you practice care in such a extractive discipline? I mean, yeah, sometimes, yeah, it might not be possible, but yeah, I am reading Pollution is Colonialism, but I haven't finished it. So, but I think that's where I'm coming from. Thank you.
That's a great book, and it's a great question. I'm going to allow some of the Indigenous scholars who are on this panel, who probably deal with it much more directly than I would as a settler, to address the question. Kim, I'm going to call you out.
I'm trying to think with the Indigenous scientists that I work with, right? I work mostly with genome scientists, although I've worked with environmental scientists before as well. Yeah, I think in general, those who are working either as Indigenous scientists and or in truly collaborative ways with Indigenous communities, they end up having their careers and trajectories changed mightily. You cannot publish as quickly. That's just a fact, because collaboration takes a lot of time, and the best collaborations are built over a long time, right? And it takes time to negotiate research contracts and different sets of ethical standards and how they're going to intersect. You can no longer just use the baseline, right? If you're doing human subjects research, for example, of just federal guidelines only, or which the university implements. And so a lot of the scientists I've seen, they're doing their work to run their labs, but they're also putting a tremendous amount of time into mentoring. Some of them actually do end up going off and specializing more in the ethical side of things and the policy side of things, but they show themselves willing to have their careers shaped not only by their own curiosities or maybe some of the other priorities in science, but they reorient their priorities in part towards what communities are asking them to do. And the best non-Indigenous scientists who collaborate do that as well. But yeah, I imagine that'd be a great panel actually to ask that question to Indigenous scientists, right? And maybe some long-term collaborators. You have to be willing to be changed and have your path severely altered and slow. And some people don't want to do that, right? And I always say, if you don't want to work right, then don't go work with somebody else. You know, Indigenous people don't need you that bad. So anyway, but I'm going to think about that as a panel. It's a good question. Thank you.
This is a great
Good luck
question.
to
In
you.
fact, I want to give it another play. Okay, you're a bit more junior than Kim and I was just wondering, you were actually telling stories about how you have some of the scientists working on the forefront of the telescopic projects or observatory projects on your campus, perhaps benefiting from it. How do you practice self-care in that mode, or how do you set boundaries in that mode?
The short answer is I don't always do it in a good way, and it's a struggle. You know, I get this question a lot, and I try really hard to answer it sincerely, and that's as sincere as I can put it. It's very difficult, and there's a lot I could say about that, and I've sort of like talked and written about this in different places. And what I can say is, it's most difficult on one hand to and let me back up. I can't not do this work. It was a kuleana that was given to me by my community members at Mauna Kea. And so this is an obligation for me. And I'm trying my best to act on that obligation and responsibility that people gave me because of my position and location here. And that's a you know, really important relationship that I want to balance with the Lahui Hawaii, the Hawaiian people and nation, including Mauna Kea. And so on one hand, to enter into private and public spaces with University of Toronto astronomers, with 30-meter telescope administrators, with Canadian agents of the federal government that are involved in the project is incredibly tumultuous. And one of the primary ways it's tumultuous for me is because it's typically entering a conversation in my side, making appeals for divestment from this project that fall on deaf ears in a sense, that it is difficult to appeal to someone even with facts, rationality, when they don't necessarily believe that you as a Indigenous person, even as a colleague of yours, right, at the same university, are perceivably as human as they are. Because in many senses, a lot of the conversation pivots on these ideas about whether or not Kanaka Maoli that oppose the project are human and are considered less than human because of ideas that we don't believe in science, and we want to turn back to the dark ages and to, you know, some primeval like past, when in reality the 30-meter telescope project is purporting as a scientific case to study the origins of the universe, right? The telescope is promising to turn back in time, and yet we as Kanaka Maoli and others, Indigenous people that are labeled anti-science, are rendered less than human. And so that's really difficult. How do you reason with somebody? How do you dialogue with somebody? How do you, in some ways, enter a negotiation with someone or government or institution or a department when fundamentally there's a lack of belief in your humanity? And I think Cree scholar Jessica Kolopanik said it best in the sense that, we're perceived as non-sovereign because of the lack of our humanity, which makes it very difficult to negotiate amongst those who believe that they can make the exception to the rule.
Thank you for that. Fantasia, can I call on you as an Indigenous scholar, as an Indigenous woman who's working inside the social sciences and inside the university world to speak a little bit about that as well?
I think this is a really complicated question, and it's around like self-care and how do we proceed. And I think mine and a lot of Indigenous movements move towards humor. And also, like, I think it's like the piece I provided, I'd like to find these kind of moments of, what do I want to say, contradiction or ridiculousness and things like that. And then, yeah, I don't know. It's a really hard question. It's a really heavy question, right? Like, how do we survive as Indigenous people in the social sciences where I am? And I think a lot of it is, staying in community, staying grounded with the folks who matter, and getting in that grandma time and remembering that not only have we been here since time immemorial, but we are actively part of imagining those futures that we cannot yet see. And so I don't have any good answers, just only big feelings.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to ask a couple of questions of Rebecca and Willie, but I do want to get to Caroline first, just in case that there's a lack of time. Caroline, can you ask your question succinctly?
Yeah, so I may be coming into this from a different space than everybody else, so I apologize if that's a problem. But I'm an astrophysicist. I study exoplanets, and I teach a class on the search for extraterrestrial life. And so I was really struck by Dr. Charbonneau's work in this piece on thinking about like who speaks for all of us in a human sense, and how do we choose if we put messages out there on behalf of humanity. And so I teach my students about this as well. So I was just wondering if you could reflect a little more on that, and also on how we as science educators can bring some of this Indigenous science into our classrooms in the search for extraterrestrial life when we teach that as well.
Thank you so much for your question. And I'm happy, I recognize we're limited on time here. So if you would like to email me and talk more about this, I work a lot with scientists and how to bring in interdisciplinary perspectives in the classroom. So I'd love to chat with you more. But to address your question, and for those of you who aren't familiar with my work, I kind of came into this subject through the back door. I'm a historian of science at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. And my main area of research actually was in Cold War radio astronomy. In particular, I was looking at the military-industrial complex and how radio telescopes, which are the instruments that are used in SETI, were also being used by the intelligence community, right? So scientists were both listening to extraterrestrials and also listening in on each other as they collaborated either across the Iron Curtain and even within their own nations, on their own peoples. And in the process of doing this, I became familiar with a scientist named Nikolai Kardashev. He was a Soviet astrophysicist, and he was describing extraterrestrial civilizations in terms of a kind of a unilinear progressive scale, technocratic, this expansionist civilization. And as I was reading his descriptions of what he imagined aliens to be like, I realized, I was like, he's writing about the Soviet Union. This is a fantasy. This indicates Soviet desires. And that got me thinking to look critically at SETI theories about alien life. And as I did that, I recognized that what they were really doing is, so subconsciously, they were describing their own world. And because it was largely settler scientists in the United States and the Soviet Union that were coming up with these theories. They were actually doing a fantastic job of describing settler science, kind of surreptitiously. And so that's how I got started in this area. And it is, I think, really revealing of the fact that this is an incredibly undemocratic world. We have really put the scientific technocratic power into very few people's hands. And there's actually another scholar who I actually think is in the audience, and I hope she doesn't embarrass me for pointing her out, but Catherine Denning has written also a lot about this, and I highly encourage you to look at her work. She wrote a great piece on how one of the issues in SETI is that there's a lot of difficulty in engaging with other disciplines, and that even when they do so, they tend to do so in an incredibly superficial way that ends up kind of going back in time and misusing humanities theories. So for example, Catherine has studied social evolution and how SETI scientists have utilized social evolutionist theories, kind of like Kardashev did. And they tend to, again, have this very basic grasp that ends up reproducing some like really terrible things like social Darwinism, like unilineal evolution. And so it's that's kind of where I would recommend that you start if you want to start engaging critically in interdisciplinary approaches to this topic. But again, I'm happy to talk more with you personally if you'd like.
Thank you so much for asking that question. I want to just simply say in response that Professor Denning's work is amazing, and she was a reader of my piece. She does not, of course, take any responsibility for the outlandish things I said and my illogical comments in there. But when we talk about SETI, it's very hard to know who we're exactly talking about. It's oftentimes a loose affiliation of people. So sometimes we mean lowercase and sometimes we mean uppercase. And not all SETI, you might want to say, affiliated scientists are the same. And Dr. Denning is at the forefront of really questioning some of SETI's own practices and trying to raise the bar to make sure that there's conversation across the disciplines. So thank you for bringing that up, Rebecca. Willie, you write about SETI. Are you still in the meeting? I want to give you, if you are here, are you here? Yeah, okay. So you're muted now, but let me just say from the very beginning, Willie was one of the first working group members. He's now with us on perhaps the last event that we've got scheduled for this. I want to make sure that his voice is heard as well, because he's been an interlocutor from the very beginning. He was the person of the original working group who was at Berkeley for the Breakthrough Listen actual session. He was the only one of the four who was there. So I want to make sure that he's brought into this conversation now. Willie, what's your engagement with SETI? And could you maybe perhaps in a sentence or two explain what it was that enabled you to talk about either Captain Cook or time knots with your engagement with SETI as an interrogator?
Yeah, thanks, David. And I'll be really brief in light of time. I think what Kim's piece, for example, does so well is just really reiterate that intentions are less important than they seem. There's a lot of very seductive things in science and ways that scientists communicate. And those folks often don't feel like villains in person. They feel like they're full of good intentions. They are, from their point of view, they see themselves as heroic and doing these broadly humanistic things, just like the folks in the Royal Society thought when they were sending, James Cook out to look at the transit of Venus, and in so many other moments. And so those folks can often do the most harm because they don't know what they're taking for granted. So they're very confident in what they're doing as something good. And so they don't think of boundaries to slow them down or think twice. And then just beyond that, really briefly, I'll just note that, in rereading all the articles this morning, even though we were thinking collectively, it really felt like a conversation. I love what everyone else did in their chapters, and it feels like a rich, holistic discussion that's more than the sum of its parts. And so thank you, especially the editors, David and Kim, and all the other authors. It was really an honor to work with you all on this, and it was a really rich process.
Oh, that was so nice of you to say. Thank you, Willie. It's an honor to be involved in projects that you care about, but it's even more so when the people that you're working with are absolutely engaged as authors. The writing in the various pieces is phenomenal. I mean, literally, all of you just really raise the bar of what academic writing can do. And so I thank you for that. And I mean Kim in that as well, even though I think of her as a peer and a friend all the way back to graduate school. Like, her writing here is really pushing the boundaries of what gets inside academic scholarship and what's worthy of thinking with. Thank you everyone who took time out of your Friday to attend this event. As again, thank you to everyone at the center and to Randy. We're going to try to end this no more than 2 minutes late. So if you want, email shorter@ucla.edu and I will get a copy of the transcripts for you. We have posted in the chat room where you're going to be able to find links to this actual recording of the event as well as the interviews. And to everyone, have a great weekend and a great spring. I know the world is tough out there, so practice self-care and stay vigilant. Be an activist in your life 24/7. We'll take care. Mahalo to everyone. Take care.
Thank you.